Welcome to The Future and You. This episode is for February 4, 2009. I am your host, Euin Cobb. Our guest today is Jerry Pournelle. This is part 2 of his 3-part interview. In today's episode, he talks about how he became one of the advisors to Ronald Reagan concerning the Space Defense Initiative, which, by the way, Ted Kennedy dubbed Star Wars because he did not believe it would ever be possible to shoot down an incoming missile with one of our own missiles. How this led directly to the Patriot Missile and other missiles which routinely do the impossible by routinely shooting down incoming missiles. How he contributed to Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address in 1980. Proposed methods of laser-based warfare using equipment available today and in the future, including one method that turns Grand Coulee Dam into a space-based weapon of immense power and very nearly global reach, so powerful that he openly admits that only one would be needed in a war. The problem with today's spacesuits, and he explains and gives examples of Pournelle's iron law of bureaucracy, which states that in any bureaucracy, the people devoted to the benefit of the bureaucracy itself always get in control, and those dedicated to the goals the bureaucracy is supposed to accomplish have less and less influence, and sometimes are eliminated entirely. Jerry Pournelle is probably best known as a science fiction writer. With Larry Niven, he has co-authored over a dozen novels including The Mote in God's Eye, Lucifer's Hammer, Footfall, Inferno, and his and Larry's new sequel to Inferno, Escape from Hell. He has also co-authored novels with Stephen Barnes, Roland Green, and Michael Flynn, and he's written many novels by himself. However, novels have only been a portion of Jerry Pournelle's work. After serving in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, he acquired master's degrees in both experimental statistics and systems engineering, and doctorates in both psychology and political science. He co-wrote a military textbook called The Strategy of Technology, which was required reading at West Point and the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. He worked in the aerospace and defense industries. He worked in operations research at Boeing, the Aerospace Corporation, and North American Rockwell Space Division. He was founding president of the Pepperdine Research Institute, and he has been a columnist for Byte magazine since 1982. When I interviewed Jerry Pournelle, I had plenty of questions and he had plenty to say. We talked for 2 solid hours. Most of that time, but not all, was interview. For your listening convenience, I've divided his interview into 3 parts. This is part 2. Next week will be part 3. This episode contains 30 minutes of our conversation. And so, here is Dr. Jerry Pournelle. It's pretty well known that you've advised certainly presidential administrations, and there's indications, I'm about to ask you a question about it, that you may have advised presidents too. It's been said several times that you wrote the Strategic Defense Initiative portion of Ronald Reagan's State of the Union address.
That's not strictly true. It has truth in it.
Okay. Some claim you did this to get more funding for space research, and since
That's what Spinrad likes to say. It isn't true.
Oh, okay. Well, since I'm pro-space, I would actually applaud that, whether it's true or not. But my question is, if you could maybe describe what led up to that, and also, do you think that this led somehow to the smaller scale missiles we use now to shoot incoming missiles out of the sky, like the Patriot Missile?
Oh yeah. Okay, in 1980, November, Mr. Reagan won the election. It happened that shortly thereafter, maybe before, but in that fall, Harry Stein and I were out at JPL for some planetary encounter or another. There was some event going. We were both there as part of the press corps. The reason we were there as part of the press corps is because when I was president of SFWA, in those days I was science editor of Galaxy magazine, and I published in a number of nonfiction articles in a number of places, including American Legion magazine, which had a circulation in the millions and was one of the better paid markets in the 70s. And I talked JPL into allowing any member of the Science Fiction Writers of America to get press credentials for when they had the big planetary encounter events. As I told their director of public relations, I said, that when you got a Mars satellite going in, the whole world's watching you, and CBS News is out here, and everybody's out here. 3 days later, they're gone. But we're still your friends. We don't keep saying, what do you got going that's useful tonight, this afternoon? And that got across to them, and they did. They allowed the members of the Science Fiction Writers of America to get press credentials to go to these things. I also got them to give one to B. Joe Trimble, who had been in charge of the fan clubs for Star Trek. He was the one who basically caused the network to bring back Star Trek for the 3rd season, because she had such a good job of organizing the fans. So Harry and Mrs. Trimble and I said, wouldn't it be neat if we could get a bunch of people together to do the same kind of thing, to lobby the new administration for a bigger and better space program. So that was the beginning. A few days later, a man who I've mentioned earlier in this interview, Colonel Francis X. Kane, by then retired, PhD. Kane, who had been director of plans for Benny Schriever, who was the 4-star general in charge of Air Force Systems Command and was now retired, but Schriever was the best-known Air Force technology guy in the world. Reagan asked Schriever to write the space and defense plan for the incoming administration, for the transition team. Kane immediately called me, because we had worked together on strategy of technology. He was the unacknowledged author of third author of strategy of technology. And Pisoni said, can you guys help me put this together? And sort of a light bulb went off, and I said, yeah, why don't we just get a whole bunch of experts on the subject and do this right? So I talked Larry Niven, who is a millionaire, into being the host of what became a thing that became known as the Citizens Advisory Council on National Space Technology. And it included Buzz Aldrin, Fred Hayes, who was at that time president of Grumman and who was the number 3 astronaut in Apollo 13. Whole bunch of people. The director of technological strategy for the North American company, the high Boeing official, George Merrick, who was at that time the manager of the shuttle program for North American. People of that caliber. And I said, while we're doing it, let's invite some people who can turn this into ideas and papers that maybe somebody will read. So we invited Robert Heinlein, Greg Baer, Dean Ng, Poul Anderson, those are the ones I remember, and Jim Baen, who was the publisher of Galaxy and was just getting started with Baen Books. So it ended up some 80 people. And we met at Larry Niven's house over a weekend from Thursday night through Sunday night. There were people from Livermore, a couple of Ed Teller's people. Teller didn't himself come, but some of his people, Lowell Wood, one of them, came. So we had a living room full of people. It wasn't 80 at any one time, but there were like 40 at any given time. And Marilyn Niven essentially played hostess and served gourmet lunches and dinners to this crowd of people who ran from the distinguished to well, I mean, they're all pretty well known. Now, because Niven was the host, I was the chairman, and people were pay attention to me. I was far junior to many of the people that were there, but I could be chairman because I was sort of that way because I asked people they want to elect a chairman, and everybody basically said, why don't you do it? So I have a loud voice, and I guess I'm arrogant enough to tell people to shut up and let's get this work done.
And that's what it takes sometimes.
It takes sometimes. So we wrote the space policy for the incoming administration, for the transition team, for the Reagan administration. And it turned out that the National Security Advisor was Dick Allen, who had been Pisoni's colleague at the Hoover Institution forever, and who had studied with Pisoni when Pisoni was a professor at Georgetown. By the way, Kane got his doctorate with Pisoni as his sponsor, also at Georgetown. So we had Pisoni, the old fox. He used to sit there and listen for 2 days and not say a word, and then ask one question that would change the whole character of the conversation for the rest of the. He was that way. He was one of the most brilliant men I've ever met. And Heinlein, who was very good at turning things into assertions that would make some sense to the public. And Niven and Art Dula, who is a lawyer, Niven and Dula wrote a paper on commercialization of space that became essentially the basis of the Space Commerce Act that was passed some 20 years later. Wasn't passed during Reagan's administration. Pieces of it were passed in Reagan's time, but there was a Democratic Congress that wasn't terribly interested. So, all told, we produced those papers, and Dick Allen presented them to the president, who read. That is, it started off in the standard setup of a one-page executive summary, a four-page summary, a 20-page report, and about 150 pages of supporting material. And Reagan read it all, every bit of it. He was a fast reader. I had met him. I had briefed him when he was governor, and I was a professor at Pepperdine. So he knew who I was, but just barely. I mean, we were hardly what you'd call close friends. But he read all of it and asked Dick Allen to ask if we would continue to provide advice in this field during his administration. So what started as a meeting to write the transition team papers became what amounted to a permanent body that met several times, produced a report each time. And I think the first one advocated strategic defense. The second one went strongly into it. By the time of the third one, we knew that Reagan intended to adopt a policy of strategic defense. And that was the one in which we wrote a paper jointly written by all of us. I was the editor, but I can't say I wrote it. But it was a paper jointly written by all of us that many portions of which were incorporated into Reagan's 1983, his March 23rd, 1983 SDI, or still called Star Wars speech. Star Wars being a term that Ted Kennedy applied to the notion of strategic defense. And Jim Baen was particularly happy because one of the phrases that had to do with wouldn't it be better to intercept these terrible weapons than to avenge them was taken straight out of the paper and put right in the speech. Reagan, as you may know, wrote many of his own speeches. He always rewrote them. He never just read a speech. And he was a better speechwriter than any of his speechwriters, or me. I mean, better than anybody I know of, including Peggy Noonan, who was one of his best. But he always rewrote things and put in language of what appealed to him. And so the SDI speech in 83 was pretty close to being what we had asserted should be the policy of the United States.
Mm-hmm. I didn't realize the involvement ran that deep and became quite as big and organized. I had no idea. I do remember at the time that the media enjoyed making fun of the concepts and calling it, like you say, Star Wars. And I kept thinking, what are they, crazy? Of course, eventually we'll be able to shoot missiles down with missiles. It's just an engineering problem.
Well, in fact, one of the participants in the conference was General Meyer, who had been the commander at Marshall when they did Project Homing Overlay, in which they literally did intercept an ICBM fired out of Vandenberg, and an interceptor was fired out of Quad, and the interceptor actually hit the Minuteman over Hawaii. They hadn't intended for it to hit. They were just trying to see how close they could come. But it actually hit. And I mean, it was clearly possible to do many of these things. You must understand, Reagan put in something that sounded like we were talking about an impenetrable shield. Nobody in our council believed you could do that.
Mm-hmm.
But if you got to remember, most of the other guys' birds are not targeted at cities at all. They're targeted at our birds. Well, otherwise, he fires his force off, he blows up all of our cities, and the Minuteman force fires off and blows off all of his. Nobody would think it would be a good idea to start a war in which it was clear that the end of it would be that both nations were gone.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're going to start a war, you start it with the notion that you might win it. Does that not make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd think.
Well, if you're going to win a nuclear exchange, how do you do it? Well, you have to take the other guy's birds out before he can fly them.
Mm-hmm.
So most of his force has got to be targeted against our force. Well, our force is hardened. It's not easy to knock out. It can be done, but you have to have more than one bird targeted at you see what I mean? You can't just do one-on-one. If you want to take out 90-something% of our force, you're going to have to fire about 3 warheads at each one of ours. But you ain't got that many missiles, so you have to have multiple warheads, which means we can intercept your multiple before you can spew out its multiples. Then we're knocking out 10 for 1. There's a whole bunch of math in this that I'm not going to get into on the radio, but the point is I don't have to take out everything or even most of what he's launching in order to make him wonder whether he's got enough of my force to have made it worthwhile launching all of his. I don't need for when the Politburo says, Comrade Marshall, if we start the war tomorrow morning, will we win? I don't need the Marshal to say no. I need the Marshal to say, I don't know. Now, that is an effective missile defense. Because the other guy, I mean, it's a perfect defense because the other guy didn't launch in the first place. I mean, the best way to survive a nuclear war is not to have one. The best way not to have one is to make the other guy think, gee, it ain't worth it.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask you a hypothetical question concerning the future. And this is, of course, just another engineering problem. And that is, I'm more and more convinced that eventually we will have bullets that shoot approaching bullets out of the air, maybe launched from, say, a flak jacket or what is now today a flak jacket. Do you think that this is possible?
Possible. It'd be terribly expensive. I don't know whether it would. You'd have to work the numbers as to whether it's worth it, or there might be other ways of. Armor is cheaper than reactive armor for obvious reasons. Passive armor is much cheaper than active defense. If we could have hardened the cities, that'd be cheaper probably than building ballistic missile defenses, except that you can't harden the cities. So long as you can survive casualties by passive armor, you're probably better off adding passive armor. But these are operations research questions that I really am way out of the field by now. But I would say, yeah, it's not only possible, it's likely at some point, but when, I don't know. It might well be that you use a laser to intercept a projectile, but I don't know what you use to intercept a laser.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, good point. Yeah.
When I have a laser good enough to burn up a projectile before it can kill me, that laser is just as easily a weapon as it is a defense.
Mm-hmm. And then they'd all be wearing tinfoil for reflection.
The problem with lasers has to do with power. We have airborne lasers that have shot down airplanes. We know you can do it, but it takes a hell of a lot of power, and the range is not all that good, at least not in the atmosphere. In space, it's something else. One of the concepts of ballistic missile defense is an enormous laser built up near Grand Coulee Dam. Now you shove a mirror into orbit, you fire up a mirror and control it. You fire your huge laser beam at it, and you use it to raster an incoming target area and burn up everything that's coming in. Once you've got all his missiles, you go burn up his airplanes. as Lowell Wood put it when he said, how many of those would you need? One per war. Is it possible? In theory. There are a lot of engineering problems, and you would need essentially the entire power output of like Grand Coulee Dam, which means the Grand Coulee Dam becomes a big target for the other guy. You see, there are a whole bunch of things that all fold together when you're trying to come up with an operational defense.
I wanted to ask you, you have popularized a law which you call Pournelle's Iron Law of Bureaucracy.
Yes.
I'll quote it here. In any bureaucracy, the people devoted to the benefit of the bureaucracy itself always get in control, and those dedicated to the goals of the bureaucracy that it is supposed to accomplish have less and less influence and sometimes are eliminated entirely. I'm not young enough to ask you to defend that because I've seen far too many examples of its accuracy, but I will ask you, where do you see it most strongly these days?
The United States Department of Education and the whole education establishment.
Mm-hmm.
And the education establishment is the perfect example. You have classroom teachers who are clearly dedicated to the education of children.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, educating the young is a very rewarding experience to begin with, and many people would do it for very little money. We know that because they did for a very long time. I mean, some people just want to teach. But we have an enormous gatekeeper establishment that basically says that you have to go into debt for the rest of your life in order to get a teaching credential. And the whole purpose of the bureaucracy and the teachers' unions is what? Is to protect the totally incompetent teachers. I think the last time they fired a teacher for incompetence in L.A. was like years ago, and yet you're not going to tell me there are no incompetent teachers in Los Angeles, considering that half the kids never graduate. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
Obviously, you've got bureaucratic stultification to the point where people are beginning to do homeschooling and charter schools, anything to get out from under it. And so what do we do to fix it? We put up No Child Left Behind, but the only way you can be sure that no child is left behind is to make sure no child gets ahead, isn't it?
Keeping them all equal, so to speak.
Well, I mean, think about it for a minute. This is not Lake Wobegon.
Mm-hmm.
Half the children are below average.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they are.
They have to be mathematically.
Half the children are below average. That means that half the kids are going to get below average scores on a national test.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how do I raise the average score? I'm not going to do much better at making the geniuses get even better scores because most of them getting 100% now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I take not the very dumbest in the class, but I take the next layer and I try to get them up 5 or 6 points, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good allocation of our educational resources, to ignore the bright kids and put most of your time into the people who are at like the 30th and 40th percentile?
Well, is there any movement to improve that?
Well, charter schools, homeschooling, but it is all done. Merit teaching, merit pay for teachers. There is probably no single concept more adamantly opposed by teachers' organizations than merit pay for teachers. And yet, of course, the best teachers want it, don't they? Who is it doesn't want merit pay for teachers? Competent teachers? You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
And yet there is no single thing that is more adamantly opposed, I mean right down to, war to the knife, than things like merit pay for teachers. Not cutting pay for bad teachers, just paying good ones more.
Mm-hmm.
They see the handwriting on the wall with that one, don't they? The fact is the people who are dedicated to the teachers' unions are the ones who run for office, right?
Mm-hmm.
The people who want to teach are not interested in holding office in a teachers' union, are they? They want to be down in the classroom teaching. So as a result, the iron law always applies. The people who are dedicated to the organization itself get in control. And once in control, the people who are dedicated to the goals of the organization have less and less influence, to the point where often they have none at all.
Some people have said that NASA has this problem too.
For a long time. There are some centers of excellence at NASA, but not many. The turf wars between Marshall and Ames over spacesuits, and this is something I know something about, got to the point where the bureaucracy was just total. New ideas not invented here, all kinds of things. I mean, we haven't had a decent upgrade development in spacesuits since Apollo, really. Not much. The shuttle extravehicle activity suit is not much better than the Apollo. We're still running on 3.5 to 4 or 5 pounds of pure oxygen. Well, if you go on pure oxygen, at low pressure pure oxygen, what do you have? You have to have pre-breathing. You can't have unscheduled extravehicular activity, can you?
No.
If you run on 12 pounds of air, you can just climb in the suit and go out there and do anything. But to do that, you have to have a different kind of suit. We haven't got that kind of suit.
Yeah. How do you, I mean, the main problem with higher pressure in a suit is, of course, that it makes the limbs less flexible and makes it more work for the astronaut. How do you work around that?
Use younger astronauts instead of requiring PhD. Look, when Minsky and I were involved at one time in looking at designs for automating deep underwater oil well drills, it never occurred to either one of us that they'd either marvel their eye out to get on a diving suit and go down there and try doing it. You see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
You don't send PhDs in math and operation research down to the bottom of the ocean to do hard manual labor. You send riggers. You train an oil rigger to dive. Well, it's the same thing with space. The only people who get to go to space are old farts who have doctorates in this, that, and the other. What the hell? Of course they can't work all day. They're 40 years old. You need 18, 20-year-old riggers. The Navy doesn't put senior officers out chipping paint. When you got an 18-year-old sailors going out and doing the hard work, the officers tell them what to do. They don't even do that. The officers just say what needs to be done, and the chiefs tell them what to do. But that's the Navy knows how to be organized. NASA never has. NASA came out of the Air Force largely, and the Air Force is one of these crazy places that have pilots, technicians, and everybody else.
Oh. Let me ask you, the armed forces, as far as I know, have avoided the problem, but am I wrong? Am I just too outside the loop to see it?
They avoid much more of it than most. You know why?
Why?
Think about it. If you have a country and countries that never have wars do not avoid it at all. But if you have wars, then you can safely assume that just about every senior officer has at one time been out in front of 100 men with rifles and they didn't kill him.
A bit of a filter?
Well, think about it. Yeah. The most common cause of officer death in World War II was 30 caliber rifle bullets, and oddly enough, the Germans never had any 30 caliber weapons anyway.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Troops have a way of seeing to it that unpopular officers don't survive the war. Now, I don't mean by unpopular in the sense that people like them. Nobody ever liked MacArthur. But he sure got a bunch of guys to go ashore at Incheon in the Korean War and to do the utterly impossible. Pat, nobody liked him, but they sure followed him to hell.
Yeah, there's a different kind of like when you're at war. I think it's if you feel confident that they're going to bring you back alive, or most of your guys back alive, then yeah, there's that willingness to follow them.
What is somebody who you know is concerned about that? Well, an example in World War II, Bradley was known as the soldier general, but Bradley chewed up a battalion a day in Normandy and gained like 300 yards or something for over a month. And finally they couldn't stand it. They put Patton in charge. He did some preparations, and in 3 days he lost more men than Bradley had in a month, but all of France fell.
Let me ask you a question.
By the way, I kind of exaggerated that, but not by a lot. I mean, once the Normandy breakthrough occurred, there were some enclaves of Germans left in France, but basically the French the French War was over, and we had been at very much of an impasse until they put Patton in charge. Didn't leave him in charge either.
Yeah. They just turned the bulldog loose for a while, I guess.
Yeah. I always used to think about Curtis LeMay, who was a terrible man to work for. He really did not understand technology and didn't like technological work. I always thought about LeMay is what you really want to do with him is put him in a stasis field. Now, you come up, 20 years from now, you open a stasis field. General, the United States is at war. Right. Which way is the enemy? You need guys like that. But you don't want them planning the force. You want them directing the force after it's been built.
That was Dr. Jerry Pournelle. You can learn more at jerrypournelle.com. That's spelled JerryPournelle.com. That's it for this episode of The Future and You. This program is licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivative Works 2.5 license. A copy of this license may be viewed at creativecommons.org. Briefly, this means you may, indeed you are encouraged to, copy this entire program as many times as you wish and give it away to as many people as you wish. But you may not copy only a portion of this program, you may not charge anyone any amount of money for it, and you may not use any portion of it to make something new. On the other hand, anyone whose obvious goal is to recommend the show to others automatically gets special dispensation. Offline reviews, which include the show's website, may include brief quotes. And online reviews, such as for a blog or community group or web page, which provide a conspicuous link to the show's website, may use as many quotes as they wish, up to and including a transcript of 1/2 of any interview. The show's theme music is a blues number called Some Sympathy by Chris Jurgensen, and is from his album Big Bad Son, which is available at magnatune.com. Magnatune is an independent record label that sells its catalog of music through online downloads and print-on-demand CDs. The company allows artists to retain full rights to their music and splits equally with an artist all the revenue from the sale of their work. All the music at Magnatune may be previewed free of charge, and customers can even choose how much they want to pay for the music, with pricing ranging from $5 to $18 per album. You can learn more about them at magnatune.com. That's spelled magnatune.com. If you have a theory or opinion about what the future will contain, be it the near future or the far future, you may email it to me at thefutureandyou.com. That's thefutureandyou.com. You may also suggest topics that you would like to hear discussed, or send contact information for experts that you feel might provide valuable insights into the future. Mind you, an expert is not necessarily someone with an impressive degree. The best experts are the people who live or work or strive in the area under discussion. If the subject is science or medicine or academia, a degree is important, but if the discussion concerns trends in construction or firefighting or video gaming, a degree is pretty much meaningless. To get the inside dope, you've got to find the people who actually do this stuff every day. They are the first to see the trends because the trends have already begun changing their lives. As to the topics we will explore in the next episode of The Future and You, I can make no guarantees. Interviews are still being sought, recorded, and edited. All I can promise is that we will ruminate on the future. To learn more, check the show's website at thefutureandyou.com. If you enjoyed the program, please mention it to a friend, and be sure to join me again next time. Until then, I have been your host, Stephen Euin Cobb. On behalf of myself and all my guests, I thank you for listening.